In this video, you will learn how to record a macro, organize your macros in folders, set shortcuts for executing macros from the keyboard, the control surface, and external MIDI devices. You will also learn how to control the playback speed of macros, create favorites lists, and use hotspots to trigger the macros. The TriCaster Professional line allows you to record a sequence of events while using the system, and then play that series of events back in real time or at different speeds. Let's set up the TriCaster environment. Put ME1 on Preview and Program. It should be the comp shot we used earlier in the video segment. Use Net1 with no input for layer A in ME1. This is a blank layer, and it removes the talent. You could also use an empty frame buffer to do this. Load the Riverwalk image into Buffer 7. Use Buffer 7 as layer B. Make sure Keyer 1 in ME1 is on with the NewTek logo from Buffer 12. If you need to scale and position the logo, do so. The shot should look like this. Put ME2 on Preview and Program. Go to an empty preset in DDR2 and load the center shot of Rex. Play and loop DDR2. Use DDR2 in layer A of ME2. This puts Rex on set. Use Buffer 7 with the Riverwalk image as layer B. This ends up in the monitor. Let's start out with a simple macro. Earlier in the series, we learned about delegating the T-bar to do more than one thing at a time, like to do a background transition and bring up a downstream keyer at the same time. But what if you don't want to delegate the T-bar to do this? Well, you could accomplish it with a macro. To do this, first, you need to record the macro. The macro menu is located here in the dashboard. The menu has three options on it at the moment. Switcher Reset is a system command that comes preloaded on the machine. This will take the switcher back to a default state. Next, there's an option to stop all macros. Then, you have the Configure Macros option. Click on this. This will launch the macro configuration editor. This menu can be sized and positioned. The interface of this menu breaks down into four areas: the macro creation, folder creation, and edit tools here, the macro list, the shortcut linker, and the speed and transport controls. There will always be a System Commands folder in the macros list. Notice the check mark next to it. Any folder of macros can be turned on and off using these check marks. Open the folder with this small arrow. Now you can scroll through the macros and view their keyboard shortcuts here. These are the default keyboard shortcuts for the system, and you can edit them. Notice the checks to the left of all macros. Any macro can also be turned on or off using these check marks. Close the System Commands folder by clicking on the small arrow again to hide them. A new macro needs a new folder, so to make a folder, hit the plus folder button. Type in a name for the folder. Let's use Training Macros. Now, with that folder selected, hit the plus macro button. This creates a new macro in the folder. Type in BG_, DSK1 Auto for the name of the new macro. This is for background transition and DSK1 Auto. With the new macro selected, the shortcut and transport controls become active. Before you start recording a macro, make sure you know exactly what it is you want to do. When creating more complex macros, you should write down the steps you need to do before trying to record them. Now this macro is super simple. We just want to be able to hit the background auto button in the main switcher and the auto button for DSK1 at the same time. We want to do this with a single button push. We will need an overlay graphic in the DSK. You can use the TriCaster logo in FrameBuffer 13. Test it by hitting Auto on DSK1. Position the Macros panel so you can see the auto buttons you need to push when recording the macro. Now, hit the Record button for the macro. Hit the Auto button for the background transition on the main switcher, and then hit the Auto button for DSK1. Then hit the Stop button for recording the macro. Put ME1 on Preview. Hitting the Play button in the macro editor now executes this macro in real time, and you see the transition first, and then the DSK. You can adjust the speed at which a macro runs here. You can slow them down or speed them up from real time, which is 100%. To make this macro run as quickly as possible, set the speed to snapshot. This will try to run all the events in a sequence at one time. Notice the loop control is ghosted. When running any speed other than snapshot, the loop option becomes available. Hit play in the macro editor to see the effect. Now the transition and the DSK happen simultaneously. Now you can set up the keyboard shortcut for it. This can be done on the keyboard, on the control surface, or on an external MIDI device. Let's start with the keyboard. To create the shortcut, click here. The panel will tell you it's listening for keystrokes. Hit the decimal point on the numeric keypad on your keyboard. Now, by hitting the decimal point, you can execute an auto on the main switcher and an auto on DSK1 no matter what the state of the UI or the control surface. Sometimes when the mouse is still in the macro configuration editor, a keyboard shortcut may not trigger a macro. Try clicking outside of the macros panel and then try the keyboard shortcut again. What if you try to set a keyboard shortcut that is already in use? Click on the shortcut area again so the panel is listening. Now hit the spacebar. This key is already in use by a system command for the main switcher auto. That is why it's listed in red. There are a few things you can do to resolve the conflict. You could just pick another unused keyboard shortcut. Or you can find the macro conflicting with yours and turn it off. Open the system commands and scroll down and find the red shortcut. Here it is. Uncheck it. This removes the conflict, but also removes that system command, so be careful. Because system commands represent the keyboard shortcuts available on the system, this means you can modify any keyboard shortcut any way you'd like. Let's leave this system command active for now by checking it and fix the conflict another way. Close down the System Commands folder. let's map this macro to the control surface. Click on the macro you selected and click on the shortcut area so the panel is listening. On the 100 series TriCaster control surfaces, the macro button is located here. On the 8000 control surface, it's located here. Hold down the macro button on the control surface and all the lights go out. Continue holding the macro button and hit 1 on the preview row to map the macro. Now, release the macro button. The macro button must be used when setting up or executing macros to be triggered by the control surface. Now, to execute the macro, hold down the macro button on the control surface and all the lights go out except the buttons that have macros mapped to them. Notice 1 on preview is lit. Continue holding the macro button and hit 1 on the preview row to execute the macro. The professional line of TriCasters features MIDI support. This means that external MIDI devices can be used to trigger macros within the TriCaster. This external device could be a USB-connected MIDI pad or even a wireless tablet running a MIDI app. The Ableton Novation Launchpad is a natively supported MIDI controller. The MIDI support only works for button pushes, so no sliders or knobs. Open the macro configuration panel. Select the macro and hit the shortcut button so the panel is listening. Now hit a button on the Launchpad. It lights up. Now hit it again and the macro runs. This gives you a whole new keypad to set your macros up on. Notice when the macro was mapped to the Launchpad button, the button illuminated. You can configure what color each button will be when a macro is mapped to it from an app in the Add-ons menu of the home page of any professional line TriCaster. iPad can be used with a MIDI application called TouchOSC. This will allow you to create interfaces for the iPad on the PC and then export them to the iPad for configuration with macros. For more on connecting your iPad to the same network as the TriCaster, please watch the network input training video. You can even use multiple devices, wired or wireless, on the same machine, expanding your production team. Now let's set up a sequence to run in real time. What we want is to switch to ME2 while zooming in, bring up a lower third for 5 seconds, and then take that lower third out. Close the macro panel. First, set up a lower third title in buffer 14 and configure it with the gear. Close the edit panel. Our plan is to switch to ME2 from somewhere, so after ME2 is on program, you can use one of its keyers to bring up the lower third. Put ME2 on preview and program. Make sure the ME setup tabs are visible. If not, hit the ME delegate button again. Hit Shotbox Preset 1 to go to the wide shot. Remove DSK1 if it is visible. Set the zoom speed in the ME to medium here. Set Keyer 1's source in ME2 to frame buffer 14. Test it by hitting Auto for Keyer 1 on ME2. Hit Auto again to remove it. Now, let's set up to record. Put ME1 on program and put ME1 on preview. Open the macro configuration panel. Click on the Training Macros folder and click the plus macro button. Name this macro Sequence 1. Position the macro's panel so you can see the controls you will need to record. Hit the record button. Put ME2 on the preview row to set this as to where you will transition to. In ME2, go to Shotbox Preset 2 to start the zoom in. Hit Auto on the main switcher to transition to ME2 during the zoom. Auto Keyer 1 in ME2 to bring up the lower third as the zoom finishes. Hit Auto again on Keyer 1 in ME2 to remove the lower third. Hit Stop on the macro recorder. Click to set the shortcut and hold the macro button down on the control surface and hit 2 on the preview row. Now, reset the switcher for the effect. ME2 shot box should be preset 1, the wide shot. Put ME1 on preview and program. Now, run the macro by holding down the macro button and hitting 2 on the preview row. The sequence runs. The speed at which the macro runs can be adjusted here. Click on the macro we made and click the Edit button. The macro is displayed in a spreadsheet. The left column shows the delay between steps, and to the right you see the actions. There is a bit of dead space at the start of the macro we made. To remove it, I will remove all of the delays down to where the first action happens here when the first zoom is activated. The delays are displayed in milliseconds, so 1,000 is 1 second. Simply select the numbers and delete them. Then hit Apply. Close the Edit panel. Reset ME1 on Preview and Program. Delegate ME2 and go to Shotbox Preset 1 on the control surface. Run the macro from the control surface by hitting Macro and 2 on the preview row. The macro starts instantly, but then runs in real time from that point on. Close the macro panel. When recording a macro, if you record the macro and then stop and then hit the record button again, then you will start recording that macro over and delete what was previously recorded. But if you record a macro and open the Edit panel and hit the record button in the Edit panel, you will be appending those actions to the current macro. You can also use macros to set up content in media players and source selections in the downstream keyers. Let's create a macro to put specific video clips in the DDR and then set up a keyer to use those video clips, all with one keystroke. This macro selects the DDR1 tab, then selects the preset for that DDR with the motion graphic in it. Then it sets up the keyer to use that DDR as its source, and the effect is ready. Go to DDR1 and go to an empty preset. Load the clip from the NewTek content called TC Powered Alpha. Turn on autoplay and single. Turn off loop if it's on. Then go back to the original preset in DDR1. Open the macro configuration panel. Click on the Training Macros folder and hit the plus macro button. Call this macro DSK1 Setup. Then hit the record button. Click on the DDR1 tab. Select the preset with the motion graphic in it. Go to DSK1 and select DDR1 as the source, and then stop recording the macro. Now let's reset back to where we were. Go to a different preset on DDR number 1. Set the source for DSK1 to network 2. Back in the macro panel, the setup macro needs to run as a snapshot, so all of the recorded events run at one time. Click on DSK1 Setup macro and use the speed pop-up to set it to snapshot. Let's set up a shortcut. Select DSK1 Setup macro. Click to set the shortcut so the panel is listening. Press 9 on the numeric keypad. If there is a conflict, fix it like we discussed earlier. Now, to set up the effect, you hit 9 on the number pad. Notice the DDR content is set, as is the source for DSK1. After running the macro, simply hit Take on DSK1 to show the full motion overlay. Once complete, hit Stop on DDR1 to reset it. Now put ME1 on Program and ME2 on Preview, and turn off DSK1 by hitting Auto. Notice the keyboard shortcuts are shown here. There's also a star next to each shortcut. Clicking on this star will add this macro to a favorites list. Make sure the macros that you made are active, and then click the stars next to the 3 macros you made. Now close the macro panel. Now click on the macro menu to open it. All your favorites are listed here, and you can even click on them here to run them. This is also a great way to quickly review keyboard shortcuts without having to enter the macro configuration editor. Put ME1 on Preview and ME2 on Program. Set DSK1 source to buffer 13. Macros are super powerful and can become quite complex. You can even call a macro from within a macro. Open the macro configuration panel and click on the Training folder and click the plus macro button to make a new macro. Call it New Transition. Hit Record to start recording the macro. Select the new transition from the main switcher palette. Now hit Auto on the main switcher and stop recording. Make this a snapshot. Set the shortcut as Preview 3 on the control surface. Let's make another new macro. Hit the New Macro button and call this one Sequence 2. Hit Record to start recording the macro. Hit the macro button on the CS and hit 2 on the preview row to run this macro. When it is complete, run macro 3 from the preview row, and the new transition happens and the DSK is brought up. Stop recording. Reset and run the macro. You are now running a macro within a macro. You can see the progress of the macros as they run in the macro configuration panel. Close the macro panel and turn off the DSK if it's on.